Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well on my end. Yeah, training away. How is your run training going?
Running has, been going really well. I had a really good 16-miler actually the other weekend, and it reminded me that sometimes you actually just need to turn off the podcasts and the I'm going to be intellectual and listen to things, and turn on the incredibly nostalgic, cheesy jams of your youth and just really enjoy the run. And, I was utterly unfocused on my watch or anything else, and it was probably one of my best runs I've had in the last couple of years, if I'm being honest.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this past weekend, I had my first 20-miler since Leadville, and all good. So that was very exciting.
Awesome.
So things are looking up. Starting to realize that I have signed up for a couple 100-milers this summer that are local, but still.
Some would say a few.
I've signed up for 2 out of the 3 that I'm hoping to do. I have not signed up for the 3rd one yet.
You haven't committed to the Triple Crown.
Well, only because there might be a scheduling conflict, so I'm just kind of waiting to see on that. But very excited for them. Also, though, starting to panic because one of them's at the end of May, and realizing, as per our article that we talk about constantly, there's less time than we think till then. Because, we're already planned out through, end of April, really, with stuff that we're putting on the calendar right now. And I'm like, oh, no. That's practically race day. So
the weekends are few for sure. Yeah, as I'm doing clinics and different things for July and August. So it comes quickly, but this is why we enjoy the present moment, they say.
Yeah. But I think that's all good. And, we're talking about it. You're signed up for a couple of gravel races that are actually very much coming up.
Well, I guess that's, we did our sort of season end review and the goal setting, and I was sort of wishy-washy and sort of just focused on whatever you wanted to do, what are your goals? So I've sort of come around, training's been going pretty well. So we were planning on sort of driving across in March. We're going back to Canada for a bit to do some snow stuff. And then eventually we'll sort of go back across to try and escape winter. So we decided to try, and we always drive all the way and don't do anything along the way. So it was in line with that sort of goal of exploration and connecting with people. I signed up for 2 gravel races along the way. So that sort of gave us places to go to, sort of, not midway, but along the route out west.
Yes, we're doing homegrown gravel down in Atlanta, Georgia. One of my authors at Stronger Publishing, Mackenzie Myatt, did it last year for, I think it was the first year.
Well, Mackenzie's how I found out about it. Yeah, I follow her on Instagram, so should you. And that's how I found out about this race. And I said, I think there's prize money at this race, which isn't the reason to do it, but it seemed like a good time, and again was sort of en route.
Yeah, and they're doing really cool stuff with, both just local vendors, and Stronger Publishing is going to be there with some of Mackenzie's books, some of my books. So that's going to be really fun. And then after that, we're going to bop down to Turkey, Texas for the Valley of Tears gravel race, which I'm really excited because it's put on by my good friend Micah Rice, who I've known since my cyclocross days.
You've interviewed him a lot, but I don't think he's been on the podcast.
I don't think he's been on the podcast. We might have to record an episode while we're in Turkey.
But he's definitely been on either, it would be like the CX Harris podcast that Bill does, which is fantastic too. Everything Bill does is really good, especially his photos and video stuff. But I think he might have been on that one, sort of talking USAC and the state of USA cycling and that sort of thing.
Yeah, he's a super interesting guy. I'm really excited to reconnect with him. It's been a long time. So hopefully we can get him on maybe to talk about the growth of gravel or something like that.
Yeah, so that race started out, and it seems like it's got some big people at it. So we thought maybe it'd be go to see sort of like this high level gravel racing, and I'll try and participate in some way.
And I'm even more excited because after that we're going to Roswell, New Mexico. So as someone who deeply loves the X-Files, I'm really excited to explore a bit of that. Have van, will travel. Very excited. If anyone has any recommendations actually for places in Arizona that aren't Tucson to go, that are kind of good for the more van lifey, working while training kind of thing, hit us up. All right. So before we get into our listener question, we kind of had some listener mail that I thought was a fun one to follow up on last week's episode, which is all about metrics. If you haven't listened to it, we're talking about things like TSS and training peaks, but then also all of the mean things that your Garmin says to you. This person said, great podcast on the metrics. The section on the Garmin training status, passive-aggressive labels gave me a chuckle. I got my Garmin in the summer of 2022, and I remember after I finished my second mountain bike race where I felt like I performed really well, I saved the ride and saw unproductive status being attached to my race ride and thought, what the? But I also agree with your take that if every activity you're doing is being recorded on the Garmin, the training status actually seems to be somewhat meaningful or accurate. Notice that during the peak summer months when I've been able to ride outdoors with it for every ride and not doing anything indoors on the trainer Peloton, so only recording rides on the Garmin, not kind of having extra stuff added in, it actually was fairly accurate. So in retrospect, the unproductive status was probably spot on, as the 3 hour and 20 minute all-out effort in the heat and humidity probably did have a negative impact on my overall fitness, but it was so worth it. So I really like that because I think that was a really kind of fun, we're both offended by the Garmin status, but we can also kind of pull back and look at it and be like, oh, maybe there's some truth to it, depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm. And so this was Kyle writing, and so we appreciate that. It was positive mail, is always nice.
Thanks, Kyle.
And it was, it's sort of episodes like that, I always go back and forth because it's like definition, so then someone's going to get grumpy that you got it wrong. So then Molly knows that I hand ring for weeks afterwards, and what we should have said and this sort of thing.
It's very annoying.
But I think it also is a good story of just sort of knowing, you can turn some of these things off, which is a challenge. But then also what they're telling you. And so it occurred to me that, even that unproductive status, that's talking about the last 4 weeks, not necessarily about the day that you did, right? Like it hasn't yet really put that into the equation or whatever. So it is sort of, like in a lot of times in life, I was trying to think of good analogies. Like maybe, we have this thing on our van where based on the kilometers or the distance, the odometer, it'll tell you when you need an oil change, but it's not really related to the oil. You might think that it's representing like the status of your engine or the oil, but it's literally just every 6,000 or whatever the number is. And you can reset it anytime you want, doing like this thing with the with the brake pedal.
Speaking of which, can we do that? It's very annoying that light's been on
we
for a
actually
while.
do need an oil change currently, so it is accurate at this moment. But the two things aren't necessarily tied. Do you see what I'm saying? Like the one thing,
I know what you mean.
It's just a count based on like when you pressed the pedals the last time, 6,000 kilometers or whatever the distance is. And then there's also like the actual engine and the status of it. And so you could have no oil left in your engine, which I think there's another sensor for that as well. But if you see what I'm saying, like sometimes these things just don't relate to what you think they're telling you. So you might see that thing pop up and think your engine's on fire, but all it's telling you is that 6,000 kilometers have gone by since someone pressed the brake pedal.
Do you remember the time we actually thought the engine was on fire because those lights came on and we ended up at a random mechanic place in, I want to say Georgia, but I might be wrong.
Right.
That was fun.
So, I mean, that's a good thing of like, ask someone who knows what they're doing and they can tell you and make sure you're good. So this
those mechanics thought we were morons. They were really nice about it and they didn't charge us, but they thought we were idiots.
Fair. So, and maybe you'd find a coach who could tell you the same thing, but it sort of struck me that these metrics are like that. And so I had another, sort of in that same direction, the thing that I was sort of mad I didn't say on this last metrics episode. So I'm thankful for Kyle's listener mail, because then we can sort of talk through this. There's so many things in our life, cars are a good example where, if you think about your heating system or your radio, there's probably lots of buttons. Look around next time you're in your car at the things you don't use in your car that you've never thought of. And now your friend might use those every day, but you might not ever touch. I don't know, like the old lighter thing, right? Some of us would have never touched that lighter. And think about the amount of space that takes up in your car. Maybe you plugged something else. You got rid of the actual thing that lit your cigarette, right? This is probably dating me because I don't think those things exist anymore. But there's lots of these, right? Like the four-way flashers. Maybe you've never touched your four-way flashers button, or what else? Like there's cruise control. Sometimes people have never used their cruise control. I use it all the time.
I was going to say, sometimes people are furious when they buy a van that doesn't have cruise control and have to aftermarket add it in.
And then I was thinking, your phone apps. How many apps do you just delete the instant you get your phone or never open? And then your friend might use tons of different ones, right? And then if you've ever used, especially a PC, like a PC computer, like what is the word I'm looking for? Not a Mac. They come with usually so much software. I'm sure Macs come with some of this too that you never even open.
For sure.
And if you're like me, you go through and you delete it all the instant you get the computer. But there's just so many things. So I think a lot of these metrics, we could probably save time not talking about them. by just deleting and turning a bunch of them off. Because, as you said, you went for a big long run, and at no point did you need to know your training status or your
detraining, by the way.
Right. Like, it just didn't. You've existed this long for this many years, and athletes around the world continue to exist without this stuff. This goes for even power sometimes. I always remind athletes that, for what we think power is this gold standard in cycling, it can be very inaccurate often. And then B, there's lots of sports that don't have them and produce fit people, like cross-country skiing, right? They don't often even do cross-country skiing, and they don't really have power, but they somehow exist and are very, very fit and capable people. So I think we always just want to keep that in line. But I think maybe that idea of like the settings you don't use, the functions you don't use in many of the things in your life, when we're looking at things like these Garmin watches or any watches, they all have something like this.
Yeah, and while they're complicated to turn off, it's not as hard as you think it is. I swear, quick Google and you can do it. I'm just too lazy to do it on my watch. Mm-hmm. Also, side note, we love Garmin. I just wanted to add that in. Lest you thought we hate Garmin because of their metrics, we actually love Garmin.
No, I'm always enticed because there's more players in it in that field, I guess. There's more options for your bike computer and your watches now. But yeah, I just stick with the thing I know. But I think that's, I have younger athletes that are into all the new different ones. So
yeah. So side note, we love Garmin. All right. Before we get into our question, just a quick shout out to our sponsors, our good friends at Payable. And when I say good friends, I genuinely do mean it. This is a company we have worked with. These are people that we've been friends with for a very long time. So we firmly stand behind the awesome product that they have made, which is the ability to take payments within a Google form. So this is fantastic, whether you're, a coach putting on a clinic, or, we've done our jersey orders with it.
And where we wanted to stay in one of these places Molly was talking about at the beginning of the podcast on our trip, the campground actually used it to book in, but then was going to email you after the fact to pay. And so had they used the Payable add-on, they could have just had our money and it would be all ready to go.
100%, yeah. And I use it actually in real life too. So it's convenient for if you're taking online orders, but I've actually used it for in real life stuff where I'm doing a Stronger Publishing pop-up or trying, I've had my authors where they have books of their own where they're just trying to sell, one copy to friend or family, or, teaching a workout class and someone wants to buy one. It's such a pain in the butt to try to have them transfer money to me and blah, blah, blah. So now they each have their own Google form, and boom, using Payable, they have their, in-person sales taken care of without having to have set up a whole website thing or anything like that. What we love about it is most people already know how to use Google Forms, are already using it. And then in 5 minutes, you can have the Payable add-on and be taking payments within that Google form. So for people that are interested in checking it out, you can use our link, payableapps.com/athlete. And that's going to take you to a page that has kind of all of our favorite templates and all that kind of fun stuff. And if you use that link, you also pay no app fees for 6 months. Plus, for limited time, new users who are using Square can save on $200 of Square app fees. So again, that's payableapps.com/athlete. Definitely check it out. All right. Into our question, all about maximum heart rate setting. So, how do I determine my max heart rate for setting my training zones? This is a great question because you kind of almost don't think about it, because I think a lot of the apps and softwares and stuff now kind of default set it for you. Mm-hmm. But is this something you should, maybe our first question is this something you should even be thinking about?
I don't know. Part of me is well, we were just talking about how some of these metrics you don't need to, you could probably just turn them off, I guess. But I guess that's the question. If you're doing okay and you got a plan, then carry on. But if you're using percent max heart rate, this would be how you need to set zones off of percent max heart rate, or what you might call a peak heart rate. It doesn't have to be the absolute highest your body could possibly go, and you need to be on the ground, almost dead. Right? Sometimes it's max or peak. So there's maybe definitions there, but that's the idea, is you want to get a pretty good representation of how high your heart rate goes, because then zones might be based off of the percent of that max heart rate.
So does this mean we need to test our peak heart rate, or how do we find it?
Well, that I guess would be the question. So most people are familiar because it's in, most of the generic, news articles or something about something like this, where you'd go 220 minus your age. And so usually that's not accurate on the individual level. But if you took, 30 of your favorite friends are at the next race, they did it, it would probably be pretty close on what they call like a population or in a sample, assuming the sample isn't, misrepresented. So on a population level, it would be pretty accurate is what I should say. Does that make sense? So yours might be abnormally high, but then, mine might be really close. And then a friend of ours might be a little lower. And then on average, the 220 minus your age would work out okay. I guess that would be the concept with 220 minus your age. So
but I guess what's the downside of using 220 minus your age?
I think, if you had no idea, it would probably be fine. And again, it might misrepresent it horribly, but you would figure that out by training. And so what I usually do is we get started training. And so you go just based off perceived exertion, maybe you plug that in and see how it works. And what you would do is, when the person goes and does a longer run like you just did, is your heart rate in what we would expect zone 1 and 2 for most of that time, below, say, 75% of max heart rate? Or did they run, what I would guess with you is that you probably could run above that because I would assume your heart rate's maybe a little higher and just, naturally. And so maybe we would see that, she did this whole time in zone 3 and 4. So maybe the max heart rate's actually higher than what we set it at. So that would be like a hint that you're either well above or well below. Some of my clients with very low heart rates, it'd be like, I don't know if there's a bottom to zone 1, but, very low heart rate. So they're at like 110 beats and maybe you put in 220 minus your age or whatever you have set. And then you actually found out that person was, 30 beats below zone 2. And they were like, yeah, that felt like a pretty steady effort. And so then you'd have to make a decision, like maybe it's just set too high. So that would be if we're not willing to test it. We can get into like ways to assess it here in a second.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, even willing to test it, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this question. Is it possible to not be able to, in training, hit your max heart rate? So I feel like for me, I suck at max heart rate. Like I do not do hard efforts very well. I kind of have like a pretty low top end, if that makes sense. So I feel like I almost never would be able to push up to what my max could be. Mm-hmm. So I think if I tried to just go with like what my max is based on a workout, all of my zones would be set too low.
Sure. And so that, sometimes this discussion is actually a hint of what you might try and edge the athlete into doing. We talked about your 5K PB last week, I think, in the metrics episode maybe, where you just were running pretty quickly in your endurance run, on a flatter thing. Maybe there was a tailwind. We don't know. Maybe
there was a guy ahead of me that I really wanted to get around.
Yeah, and you listened to some music and there was a little bit of social comparison and then you ran pretty quickly. Not max, but that was like, a 5K PB. And so that we were talking there about, that might be a hint that you could actually do like some 5K efforts, which would probably be a pretty good way to get, that's, often around 20 minutes, plus or minus. Faster runners obviously are much quicker. Some people are not as fast. But that is a pretty vigorous effort that you might actually see a max heart rate. So that would be the thing, is to go enter a 5K race and just, make sure you're rested and go really hard. And then you might actually get a bit of a good representation of the threshold heart rate, like what you held for that duration, an extended period of time. And then also what the max heart rate looked like. And so that would be my first thing, is to just look at all the historical data and see, what's there. But for you, again, that might be a way that it's like, I wonder why this person can't push heart rate to that high. But that is very normal, that it's usually like warm out, they're rested, and then there's like a social comparison, like competition that someone is like pushing themselves vigorously for, and you might not get that in training, especially in the winter, and that's normal and fine for sure.
Yeah. Okay, next question that I'm thinking of through this is, we just mentioned, okay, if I did a 5K, most of that would be kind of around that threshold pace. Is it maybe like, do you need to use max heart rate to set the zones, or would you actually be better using a different zone, especially for like depending on the kind of training or racing you're doing? So for me, obviously, I do very long endurance. That's a lot of our gravel racers that are listening. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So would it actually make more sense to set it not based on the max heart rate, but more based on like what's your threshold, and then you can kind of go below that for tempo and then below that for endurance?
Sure. And I think people who are threshold advocates, this would be Joe Friel, Andy Kogan, lots of coaches use threshold to set both the power and the heart rate zones. And I think the arguments are great for that. I don't necessarily set my zone. I prefer to do max heart rate, and then I actually triangulate them based off of the threshold heart rate as well.
Which is definitely much easier to do in cycling than it is in running, because power, you pretty much, the standard, like you would not set your power zones based on your max power.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So, therefore you kind of already have this, okay, you're setting your power based on your threshold. So of course you're going to kind of see how that works with your max heart rate. Running, it's just a little murkier because we don't have that, like...
The other alternative in cycling would be some of the people that would base it off of like a VO2 test, or what we talked about is like the maximal aerobic power, something like that. You could bring zones off of that for heart rate or power or pace, I guess, as well. I'm less familiar with all that, but that would be the more maximal power, I guess, idea.
Yeah, and that's actually how I got my heart rate zones set recently. I just did an article for consummateathlete.com over talking about just what a VO2 max test in a lab looks like. I was able to go into the Human Powered Health lab and actually get that done on the treadmill. And I talk about kind of who that's for and who it's not for. My biggest pro tip takeaway there, I guess, is if you're someone who is going to get really set on like one number or really stressed about one number, whether it's high or low, if you're someone who's kind of that more fixed mindset where it's like, oh, if my VO2 max is low, I suck and I'm never going to get good. Or if your VO2 max is high, you're fixed and you're like, oh, so no matter what I do in training, I'm never going to get better or worse. Like, this is just who I am as an athlete. Mm-hmm. I would say don't do a VO2 max test. Or if you do, tell them not to tell you what your actual VO2 max number is. Tell them to just give you your heart rate zones or your power zones. But yeah, I thought it was I think, looking at the numbers from that, I'd say heart rate wise, that's probably my most accurate set of numbers I've had in a while. So
you feel like you got close to your peak or max heart rate?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So yeah, that would be one way to do it, right? And you do get a bit of social, especially if you're rested and you go in and maybe the person doing it is like a coach or someone, that you want to impress. In your case, it was like they thought you were some older journalist who had never run and they were confused why you wanted to do this. So they were surprised when all of a sudden they had to change the treadmill. I think they thought this would be one and done like pretty quickly. And they were like, damn.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. Also, though, on the note of social comparison, the entire Human Powered Health women's cycling team was also meandering around the lab while I was on the treadmill. So when you have world tour riders that are just kind of walking past you and like kind of glancing over,
gotta look cool.
You gotta look cool, yeah.
Yeah, and that can go either way. You could see someone at some point, it's too much pressure, and then someone maybe would underperform too, right? Because again, their heart rate, their activation, their nerves.
I had to go in the bathroom beforehand and like talk to myself in the mirror and be like, you need to calm down, because my heart rate was probably already at threshold, like just with the idea of getting on the treadmill and doing it.
And so this is, even reflecting on, the goals we have for ourselves and our training goals, not like you're winning the 100-miler goals, your outcome goals, but your process goals is for you, they're like that social comparison is something you dislike a little bit, but it also does force you to work a little harder, to deal with those nerves. So there is something there where it's like, could we edge ourselves into that more often? You can choose if you set that goal, but it is where we can think about setting actions or tasks that are very achievable, like go to the group ride is pretty within your power, or your run, or run with a friend, or set up an interval session where there's even people, like I always go to this local hill where people hike up and down it all the time. And yeah, it's so that like I don't stop and I look, as you say, you look cool, right? Like you got to look cool when you're doing it. Don't look like all ragged and haggard going up the thing, and you got to look fast. And so, it's sort of choosing where you do it. Do you go do it secretly where no one can see you, or do you go out in the open where, your friend might see you doing intervals on the hill?
And I think if you're not really sure which one is going to make you perform the best, it's probably an idea to try both of them and see, because yeah, like you say, I kind of gravitate away from the social comparison type things, even though then when I look back, I'm always like, oh, that is when I perform at my best. So,
well, and then you want to ask if your race is going to include social comparison.
There is that.
If you perform worse, then that might be, again, an effective training tool, even if you perform worse, right? And that's the difficult thing for everyone wants to perform every day or to win every day, but that's not the nature of training. Sometimes you have to do the things you're less good at too. So again, just reflection when we're thinking towards, goal setting and weekly goals and this sort of thing. Now, to stay on this task here, so we talked a bit about, you did a VO2 max test, so that could be a great time to just sort of set your zones. And I always say, like, pick whatever zones you want. I don't care really what you do, but you should pick a system and stick to it. Don't go jumping around on plans or system, because really the secret to training is you sort of get training and just stick to the plan. And usually that's going to work out. You're going to find out at the end of it how well it worked, but that's usually your best practice. So set your zones however you want. And usually most systems will give you a recommendation on how to test for that. Now, we had talked about, okay, you could start off 220 minus your age. That could work for some people, maybe. And then your device might update it over time. That's the nice thing about some of these more advanced devices. We've talked about the Garmin here today, where over time it will notice that you, and all it's doing is saying you hit a higher heart rate today or a higher threshold or whatever, like you should recalibrate this. So those decisions are getting more helpful. Now there's lots of issues where you have an error and then the device updates it to 300 beats per minute.
That's what I was just going to ask about is if it does update, I think it's always worth just pausing and looking at it and being like, is this significantly higher than my heart rate? Like, was I actually going hard in my workout where this makes sense? Just kind of like do that two-factor authentication, if you will, on when it does tell you have a new high heart rate.
Sure. So then if you do have past data, I wouldn't go out and test it per se. I would just look, if you've done a cyclocross race or you've done a mountain bike race in July or past testing, go through your data. And so in Training Peaks, they have this, what's called a mean maximal power curve. They also have the mean maximal heart rate curve, which I think is just called peak heart rate and peak power in Training Peaks. So these are charts on the dashboard if you have premium. And you just look, what's the peak 5 second? Now you might have error data like we talked about, but that's a great place to go to clean up your data and you can sort of fix that and get rid of it. But then that would be the place to find what is the peak 5 second you've hit in the last 90 days and then maybe what you've hit in the last year or two. You can decide which we use. It depends on the person, because sometimes you'll have someone who hasn't really pushed it in the last year, but they did do a 5K in July last summer. And so it probably hasn't changed that much. And then you can cross-reference to what they've done recently. But again, a lot of us have had the fall here now where you might not have maxed out over the last, and that's completely fine and great. And the weather's colder and maybe you didn't race cyclocross and so you don't have it. People who race cyclocross usually have some pretty good data to go there. So that would be like the primary place I would look to set max heart rate, assuming we have someone who's motivated and racing or just training pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to get into we have the two kind of cliches of, maximum heart rate is 220 minus your age, and then that VO2 max decreases by about 10% per decade after whatever it is, 30 years old or something.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of goes with heart rate too.
Yeah. So on that note, you've coached a lot of athletes for over a decade. Would you say that everyone should kind of assume that it's going to drop over time? Or every year they should be going one beat slower.
Every January 1st, just shed a tear and shed a beat.
Bring it down.
No, I don't think so. Because I see in this active population, this is, again, a lot of this stuff like that VO2 stuff you were talking about and that you always will read, like the 10%. And then, I don't know, you're like dead in like 2 decades if you do that math, I think. But
well, it's not points. It's percentage of what
I know.
It is.
So the percent never reaches zero. I guess it's infinity. But yeah, it just doesn't really make a ton of sense. But I guess we can slow it down. And again, the average, if you sat and did nothing, it would go faster. Of course, it's going to decline. But then again, we talked about that variable last week where what if you actually did train more? And a lot of adult onset athletes didn't train as kids. So whatever it is now probably could even go up. And then, well, what do you do? Does the percentage decrease? I don't know. Like, it's just such a messy, again, this is more of like a population level. We're all eventually going that way. It all trends.
It's all going to hit zero at some point.
At some point. So I think you acknowledge that with a smile and you just keep going with where you are. And what I've seen in these athletes that I've worked with for 10 plus years, a lot of them, I always laugh because a lot of these athletes are, 10, 15 years older than me. Not a lot, but the ones I'm thinking about here. And I think all of their heart rates are 190. And I don't think really they've changed much in the last 10 years, to be honest. Like maybe they've gone from 195 to like 191 or something like that. So maybe we're talking 4 or 5 beats at most, like in these cases of athletes who have continuously trained.
Well, and some of them you may actually even see improvements because they actually, the empty nest thing happens or they retire and now they actually have more time. So even if it has gone down, you can actually sometimes see it go back up because suddenly their life actually allows for more training.
And maybe if we think about fundamental things, I'm trying to think of like the questions I get asked. That is a great question, like the aging one. Like, should I drop it? It's January. Should I drop it? Well, yeah, January 1st, your body just nicks it down one.
Clicks over.
So I laugh, but like it is a good question because that's what you would read. What was the other thing I was just thinking about? Oh, so the other thing that's tied into VO2 and maybe we didn't discuss super well enough in that power or the pace at VO2. So in the same way, the power or pace at your max heart rate or at your threshold heart rate, that's quite variable and undulates in the season. But as you say, some of these athletes, the kids are teenagers and then they've come back to training. So there was a dip where, yes, their max heart rate was still 191, but their threshold might have gone down to like, say, 200 watts. But then they're back training again. Their max heart rate's the same, but now they can hit, 250, right? So it's like a difference of what is that, 25% or something difference in the actual performance or the actual output at VO2 or at max heart rate or threshold heart rate or whatever we're talking about. So hopefully that makes sense. Like the one is more the strain on the system, the heart rate, or the oxygen consumption. And then it's like, what are you getting for those beats or for that oxygen consumption is like sort of another element to that.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Okay, is there anything else regarding max heart rate that we should be thinking about?
So there's cases where I would say like you probably wouldn't test it. So it's like someone coming out of like a pretty, cancer type situation, athletes who are getting older, athletes with heart conditions. Obviously, anyone who's been told to be careful with maximal exercise would not, go out and test this necessarily, but probably you wouldn't also be racing. So I always say, people will say, well, I'm getting older, like, should I do an interval? But then they're also doing, a maximal cyclocross race. And so it's like, well, I don't know which one, like, if you're going to do that, I don't see why training for it, is abnormal, right? And so there's all sorts of different situations. So again, know thyself. There's no like guarantee that any of this is safe for you. And this is not medical advice and whatever. But I would say if I was like, I want to really test it. And some people just for a challenge, they want to see how high they can push their heart rate. And so, okay. So what I would probably do if it were me, I would warm up really well on a warm day. We talked about the social thing. So maybe I'd get a friend or like go again someplace where people are watching or have like you come and just like watch and just
Heckle.
Be like, yeah, just don't let me quit in the last 2 minutes of this hill or something. And I'd warm up super well. So big max efforts, pushing heart rate up towards threshold or, higher and higher and higher with like sort of 30, 45 second efforts. Really building that heart rate up in the warm up, take a bit of a break, make sure I'm fueled, so maybe taking a gel again, because all of this is going to affect the heart rate and affect the perception of effort and the performance. And then I would probably do something like a 5-minute or 6-minute effort where I'm already activated, heart rate's up, and then I would just try and really push that up as high as I could. And probably more with the 5-minute versus the 20-minute, but I guess people can do whatever they want. But again, once you get into these longer efforts, assuming you're not just fading and just, collapsing in the effort, as you go, like the performance is dropping, I think probably the 5-minute would be the way I would go with it. But again, and I think we talked about that sort of matches what you would do like for that VO2 max type effort. So I think that's what I would do. But you could also do something like where you would do like 140 beats and then for 30 seconds or a minute, and then you try and push it the next minute up a little bit. Something almost like a VO2 max test, but you could do this outside on a hill where you just like look at your device and you keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and sort of ramping it a bit more.
Ooh, that leads me to one last question I'm having.
Okay.
Indoor versus outdoor.
Oh.
Because, we talk about this with power, like your indoor versus outdoor might be a little bit different. I'm thinking about it. I think depending on your indoor setup, I could see your maximum being a little bit different. Just, for the same kind of factors we talk about with power, there's less stuff going on around you. So maybe you can actually get more maximal. Flip side, you may not have the same airstream and, fresh air in your face and that kind of like, cooler or natural cooling things that you'd have outdoors.
Sure. So the advantage indoors would be that you don't have to look where you're going or balance yourself, I guess. A lot of times you mentioned the VO2 max test. And so what I recall with that is that a lot of people don't usually hit max heart rate because it's a pretty fast test. And because it's indoors, it can be hard to, use all your muscle mass or really move the bike side to side. You're not balancing. So,
well, certainly with the VO2 max test like done in a lab, you also have a mask on your face. So frankly, like you're snotted up before you can ever really get to
which I mean, maybe restricting that, maybe that helps with the max heart rate. I don't know. Now you were running, so maybe some of those complaints actually are not valid for running, and maybe that actually is the safest. And some of the more advanced ones, they'd have like a harness so you can like fall off the back of the treadmill when you max out. And again, that's where some of these safety things actually need to be put in place if you really are maxing out. So this is where we get to like peak versus max. You know, if you just collapse from lack of oxygen off the back of a treadmill, you've probably pushed your heart rate and your VO2 and everything demand higher. So that might be a factor for sure. I don't have a strong opinion either way. I would do it outside again so that there's heat and I can stand up, and I just find my performance is better outdoors going up a hill. But you may decide something different, right? I have lots of people who much prefer riding indoors on the trainer, and so probably go wherever your happy place is and go with that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
But all that to say, like there could be a slight differentiation between what you can do inside versus outside, kind of just depending on you.
Mm-hmm. Which maybe gets to that idea of the peak and the max, where sometimes, you know, I've hit 101 and 102% of max heart rate on a very hot, really good race that I was doing. You know, it's just abnormally hot day. Usually it's in June, July. You know, nationals, whatever it is. And so just like really motivated, everyone's there watching, you know, and you're just going. And so.
But you're not necessarily going to reset your max heart rate because of that.
No, I don't think so. I think that's what you're getting at is if you set it at these, you know, once in a year type values versus the value that you hit a bit more often. Again, you probably wouldn't hit it all the time, but sometimes there's just those little irregularities, and I would not base it off of that. Probably a related question is sometimes we all have people who have these arrhythmias where your heart rate goes to 220 or it goes higher for just a short period. And you know, you should go to the doctor and get checked out. Often it's not a huge deal, but you might just sometimes have this where your heart rate has hit this max heart rate. But in that case, I would not use that either. I would still stick to what you generally would use. And so maybe just to finish, some other things that I would sort of just triangulate is that often if you know your threshold, then you can know that it's sort of like 10 or 20 beats at most, usually, that you'll see. I'm sure there's exceptions between that threshold and that max heart rate. So that would be, so if you're 180 beats for your threshold, you might be 200 or 190 or 200 beats for the max. And so if you have it set, and sometimes people will get plans or consult with me and it'll be, you know, whatever, 160 and then 165 for the max. And it could happen, but it's unlikely that they're that close. And then on the vice versa, sometimes people just haven't set it and it'll say 140 beats for the threshold and then 193 beats for the max. And in that case, probably the threshold isn't accurate because that's a fairly low value, depending on the person. But you know, you don't often see 140 as a threshold heart rate. So that would be the things to consider there, is just also just triangulating that way again, where you have the threshold values. And I guess the final thing, again, not necessarily related to max heart rate, but that Maffetone method of sort of getting that 30-minute aerobic heart rate where you go 180 minus your age. Again, another formula, but that one tends to work pretty well, is my experience. So if you don't know what to do and you want to start training, I always find that 180 minus your age, and then you decide, is this an easy ride? You ride under that value if it's an easy ride, and if it's a hard ride, ride over that. And so that's a very simple, like, you have two options. So if I was 40 years old, it would be ride under 140 beats for my easy rides, and then for my harder rides, which could be moderate or hard, we don't care. It's a 2-zone system. This is very simple. You just ride over that. So if it was 5 by 4 minutes, try and get your heart rate over 140. I expect you'll be able to do that. But that would be the quick start sort of method as well. And by doing that type of just get going, you've set your zone, your endurance zones pretty clearly. We want to figure out the harder zones, but that'll come with time. And so that would be my advice. If you don't really want to test, you're someone who maybe shouldn't be really maxing out too much and you want to get training, I would just sort of set things based off of that. And again, you could set the max heart rate to try and find that rough endurance zone split. So there you go.
Perfect. All right. Well, if you have any follow-up questions or any questions, training, racing, nutrition, all that fun stuff related, definitely hit us up over at Consummate Athlete on Instagram and consummateathlete.com, where you can also find tons of freebies, articles, all the podcast notes, all that fun stuff. All right. With that, happy training, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.